Hello, my name is Nicholas Morgan. I'm an editor at Aval News, and this is Turkey Abroad. Joining me today is Samuel Rahmani. He is a doctoral candidate at Oxford University in International Relations, and he is writing a book now on Russian policy in Africa. Samuel, it's a great pleasure to have you here with me today.
It's great to be here too.
So we're probably going to end up touching on Russia at some point as well in this, but the main focus is going to be on Turkey and Africa. And I know that you have a background on this too. You've documented Turkish foreign policy through in Africa in recent years, and it's very interesting that we get to have this kind of conversation because I think for a lot of people, Turkey is not a country that automatically comes to mind as a potential major player in Africa compared to, say, China or even Russia in this case. We know that, of course, there was the military intervention in Libya where it helped shift the conflict. They have the military base in Somalia, and they have a fairly large trade volume at this point. I think it's around 26 billion as it was last recorded across the continent. But what I want to ask you is it accurate to describe Turkey as a power in Africa today? And how did it really reach the point where it's at right now?
So, to begin with a bit of context, obviously Turkey has got a historical sort of ancestral attachment to Africa that dates back to the Ottoman Empire, and that dates back to the fact that much of North Africa was under the jurisdiction of Ottoman control. And it's natural that nostalgists for Turkey's great power status would look to Africa as a means of showing Turkey as a global power. So that includes people like Ahmet Davutoglu, who in 2001 really kind of emphasized the importance of Turkish foreign policy reorientation towards Africa. And in some of his writings and in some of his rhetoric, Davutoglu became like kind of the ideological godfather of Erdogan's current ambitions of projecting Turkish power in Africa. But if you look at Turkey's role over the past century, its involvement on the continent is very sporadic and it's very inconsistent. It doesn't dovetail with the relatively consistent contributions of the Soviet Union and then Russia, China, or European colonial powers on the continent since the start of the Cold War. During the early stages of the Cold War, Turkey established a network of partnerships that were primarily based on anti-communism, and also their relationship with the United States. One such partnership was with Nigeria, but the 1967 war polarized Turkey in Africa because Turkey had a close security partnership with Israel in those days and was a Cold War partner of the United States. And the rise of Soviet influence in Africa during the 1970s and the backlash against Israel after 1967 and 1973 limited Turkey's role and its influence on the continent. Then in the 1980s, as some of those ideological polarizations began to gradually ebb, and as the Soviet Union began to focus more on consolidation rather than expansion on the continent, Turkey tried to poke its way back in with, for example, in Mali, it was involved in providing military and technical assistance, economic assistance in the early 1980s, and helped cover some of their sovereign debt that they had owed. So that was one way in which they got involved. But Turkey's really did not kind of develop a coherent Africa-wide strategy until 1998, when Africa became an important part of its concept. And then with Davutoglu's ideological inspiration and then Erdogan's ascension to power in 2003, we really started seeing a rapid increase in Turkey's presence on the continent. And that's been a 15-year initiative, really, since Erdogan first touched down on the continent in 2005. And I would say that it's erroneous to say that Turkey is a great power or aspirant or an emerging great power in Africa. At $26 billion, its level of trade is maybe comparable to Russia in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but certainly far below India, which is not even really often mentioned as a power. That's at 60 billion, and significantly below that of obviously China and many European countries. So Turkey's economic footprint is quite limited. Much of it is clustered in North Africa, and the geopolitical power projection is concentrated in a handful of countries. So Libya, their close relationship with Algeria, as well as the Sahel and the Horn of Africa through Somalia and Sudan. Turkey's presence and importance as a player in Southern and Central Africa is relatively limited. So Even though it may have 42 embassies on the continent and it may have a continent-wide diplomatic presence, it may be a participant in continental associations like the African Development Bank, it is not really a true continent-wide power because its power is clustered in relatively small number of centers. And thirdly, Turkish soft power seems to be exceeding its hard power with regards to humanitarian aid deliveries, with regards to economic investments that are seen to be beneficial to the African people. And it remains to be seen whether or if, given Turkey's budgetary constraints and its other engagements in the Middle East, whether that hard power could ever catch up to its soft power. That's an open question.
Mhm. And it's really important, I think, to note for our listeners that whenever we talk about Africa, it is not with the intention to describe it as a monolith, of course. And I think that might fly over maybe a lot of people's heads when they're thinking about how any country might be making policy in regard to any Africa policy. But that's why I would like to kind of ask you now on how, say, Turkish policy might differ in other corners of Africa. Of course, more often than not, and you already mentioned it, we hear about Turkey's presence in North Africa, where historically the Ottoman Empire had a presence in that area. And now, of course, we have the war in Libya, where Turkey's very much involved in, or competition with Egypt, frankly. But for instance, you wrote a piece last year on Turkey's strategy in the Sahel for the Middle East Institute, which I thought was personally a very very good tour through how Turkey's making its soft power felt in that part of Africa, as well as hard power, of course. And you also mentioned its presence in the Horn of Africa. But can you run through how Turkey's priorities differ, say, in each of these corners of Africa, East, West, Sub-Saharan, so on?
That is a good question. So I would say in North Africa, obviously the strategy that Turkey is focused on is really centered around its ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean and its ambitions in Libya in particular, because obviously Turkey's got the energy agreement with Libya, which is a very controversial one, which was signed in November of 2019, which is aimed at expanding its littoral and maritime waters above those that would be offered by UNCLOS, and certainly dramatically above what would be offered by alternative association agreements, exclusive economic zone agreements like Italy and Greece and Egypt and Greece. Turkey is not a member of UNCLOS either, so that's an important distinction that they're trying to engage in a degree of legal revisionism and territorial expansion in those areas. So it's centered around their power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's centered around their desire to expand the reach of their energy investments and also to secure trade. Because when the figure of Turkey's trade in Africa hit 20 billion in 2018, only 7.9 billion of that was located in sub-Saharan Africa. Trade overall on the continent has increased by about 5 times. Sub-Saharan trade has increased by 8 times since Erdogan took over in power. So sub-Saharan African trade is growing faster than North African trade on a percentage-wise basis, but it's still North Africa is still very central to Turkish commerce. And we're seeing Turkey building partnerships with Algeria because of Algeria's ability to engage in dialogue facilitation within Libya, as well as its vitality as a potential long-term economic partner. And of course, their aspirations of reconstruction contracts in Libya are driving this. So $30 billion of reconstruction is their target. Maybe unrealistic, but it's there. And now with that opening or potential de-escalation between Turkey and Egypt, if that goes anywhere, then Egypt could become another vector of that. So North Africa is really about economics. It's really about holding the line in Tripoli with the unity government that's favorable to it. Abdul Dbeiba certainly is favorable towards Turkey. So that's a positive thing. And it's about their broader Eastern Mediterranean power projection strategy and their legal revisionism with regards to their coastline and their energy exploration. That's what North Africa is all about. When you look at West Africa and when you look at the Sahel, their objectives are quite different. Turkey is viewing its involvement in the Sahel mainly from the context of soft power. I think it's trying to show that it is a counterweight towards France in that area. So it's an extension of some of its anti-French sentiments in Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean being projected there. Turkey was very critical of France's Operation Serval operation in Mali in 2013, as well as Operation Barkhane. So Turkey is trying to engage in fierce criticisms of the French counterterrorism policies, while offering relatively little in terms of solutions of its own. So soft power in opposition towards France is an important dimension of its policy in the Sahel. In the long term, if its infrastructural and economic investments and geopolitical ties strengthen there, it could act as a spoiler for French interests there, which could give it bargaining leverage with France in Libya and the Eastern Med. At least that's what, and in the European Union, which at least is what Turkey's hoping for in the long run, but that's a while away. So potential bargaining power and acting as a spoiler against France is important in the Sahel and West Africa, as well as humanitarian aid, infrastructure development across the continent, and connectivity between the region and Libya. So Nigeria is important in the Turkish strategy simply because it is of its close geographical proximity towards Libya, and the Emiratis and others have noticed that strategic significance too. So it's about pushing out rivals and engaging on the fact that it's close to Libya. So that's what the Sahel is really all about. It's really about that, and any profits and any investments that Turkey is accruing there is largely secondary to that. Then, if you look at the Horn of Africa, which is the third vector in Eastern Africa, you're looking at port construction with regards to Suakin in Sudan, in particular, but especially now that Russia's got the base that's being developed in Port Sudan. Turkey wants to be not left out of the scrum over there. It's got its foothold in Somalia, which is a central point. So if it's got a stronghold in Somalia and a potential foothold in Sudan, as well as a growing economic relationship with Ethiopia. Ethiopia was one of the first countries Erdogan visited in 2005 in his original tour. Ethiopia and South Africa were the two sub-Saharan countries that he visited. So they have a long-standing relationship with Ethiopia, which is quite positive. And if Egypt-Ethiopia tensions flare over the Grand Renaissance Dam, that will get stronger too. So Turkey wants to get more investments and trade with Ethiopia, and also a port access in Sudan to complement their military base in Somalia. That's really what Horn of Africa is all about. The remainder of the region, I would say Turkish policy is much more amorphous and much less developed. Some of its outreaches in Central Africa and Southern Africa, I think, are about UN votes. Like the UNGA, for example, they powered Turkey to non-permanent Security Council status in 2008. So things like that are important. And also cracking down on Gulanism. So it's more those kind of attributes rather than a clearly defined strategy. Their strategies are sharper in Northern, Western, and the Horn of Africa.
Mm-hmm. And in the background of all of this that I'm also detecting is that Turkey's wider rivalries in foreign policy seem to be carrying over into Africa as well. Like as you mentioned, in West Africa, it's against France or it's against the UAE. North Africa and Libya, they're against Russia, Egypt, the UAE, and France as well. And then, of course, in the Horn of Africa, the Gulf countries and Turkey have also competed. If I remember correctly, when Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, fell, it also became briefly a bit of a proxy squabble between Turkey and those countries. But even if Turkey might not have, say, the resources or reach inside Africa that their rivals may have, how has it managed to really carry over and effectively compete on the continent?
So I think that Turkey's advantage that it has that the other rivals do not have is a soft power. So that was what I noted earlier. Is the question is, will its hard power ever really catch up to its soft power? And that might be difficult, but its soft power is a big advantage because Turkey, even though it does have Ottoman legacies in Northern Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's never been seen as a colonial power. It's never really been seen as heavily involved in the Cold War fighting beyond the fact that it was a ally of the United States. It was kind of pursuing anti-communism in a very limited set of ways. It unlike China, unlike China, unlike Russia, unlike France, unlike the United States, it doesn't have those kind of negative, pernicious legacies or baggage on the continent, and that's a significant advantage that it has too. Therefore, it can invest in terms of humanitarian assistance. Like, for example, it prioritizes the fact that it was the first country to deal with Somalia's famine and one of the first countries to provide aid. It's provided $1 billion in aid to Somalia since that time. So that's quite significant. It can invest in infrastructure. And if you look at their COVID-19 efforts, Africa has played a very central role in the delivery of PPE equipment and supplies. The Emiratis have also been involved in that game too, but the Turks did so even faster and more expansively in some cases, which is an advantage. And there's also just other things, like the promotion of Turkish culture, the promotion of sort of brotherhood and with the Islamic states in that region. So that religious
Mhm.
diplomacy is an important factor. The growing proliferation of Turkish airlines and tourism. So there's many different soft power mechanisms that Turkey has, beyond, and as well as that lack of a colonial legacy, which gives it a significant advantage. And from that soft power base, it can compete in terms of expanding its trade links. It can engage in more military presences in Libya and Somalia from a position of trust and from a position of respect. So whereas other countries, their starting point is economic deals, military bases, coercion, and then be optionally trying to win the hearts and minds of the people. Turkey is starting by winning the hearts and minds of the people and then using that as a base, which means that it's got a unique set of power projection, a unique set of strategies that its rivals cannot counter. And in the long term, if Turkey can match its soft power with hard power, it can be quite impactful.
Mhm.
It could perhaps outcompete the UAE in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. And in Libya, it could potentially rival France's counterterrorism strategies. It could engage more actively in the African Development Bank, which could even serve as a bridge to the United States and Europe against China. So there's many different things that we could see happening going forward.
And that's an interesting point right there too. And we talked on this before too, in the way that say Turkey can even leverage its interactions in Africa, its policies in Africa, and some of its dealings, say like with the United States. We spoke about recently how that could carry over into the economic realm. And especially right now, with President Erdogan looking for an opening with whether it's the West or other neighbors on trying to de escalate some of these tensions after realizing Turkey's effectively surrounded by more rivals than anything. That's an interesting thing to note as well. But do you think that some of these countries, say in the United States' case, they could actively leverage, say, this Turkish presence, whether it's in Libya where they have the secure, they have the political influence and the security power, or as you mentioned, like their presence on the African Development Bank.
So Turkish involvement in Africa is not getting enough attention, I would like to say, from the current U.S. administration, as well as from the past two administrations. It's really been something that's been largely overlooked and under the radar. And Turkey's potential to act as a partner in Africa has also been overlooked as well. So that's kind of one point I wanted to make. I think that the ability for the U.S. or other Western powers to harness their relationship with Turkey and Africa first is rooted in developing a clear strategy towards Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Biden administration has yet to do that. So that would have to come first, and then engagement would come next. So that's kind of what my initial point is.
Mhm.
And yes, there are many different ways in which, if a Turkey strategy is developed, and if some kind of balance between coercion on Turkey's worst successes and destabilizing behavior of Erdogan against some of its more positive contributions is achieved, there are several areas in which cooperation can be reached.
Mhm.
First of all, I would say in the context of Libya, Turkey acts as a bulwark against the expansion of Russian influence in that country. In particular, because Russia has got preferential control over eastern Libya and southern Libya, in particular, its oil fields in and around Shara. The Wagner Group private military contractor presence is not going away, regardless of whether the UN says all mercenaries should go. Turkey is also probably not going to be getting rid of its Syrian mercenaries either. So it's got a military ground presence as a bulwark against Russia. And also, if Russia were to establish a naval or air base in eastern Libya, which seems a nightmare to the freedom of navigation in the Mediterranean, so an air base would probably be based in Tobruk, a naval base would probably be based in Benghazi, and Russia could eventually even use that to hold blackmail over migration flows. In that kind of doomsday scenario, a strong Turkish presence with strong U.S. support and commitment in Western Libya could actually be quite a positive thing for the NATO alliance and a strong bulwark against Russia. So we should be looking at it from that perspective too. With
Mhm.
regards to investments, I would say Turkey's economic footprint, as I said, in sub-Saharan Africa is relatively limited. It's maybe about just over 8 billion. So their ability to actively provide capital is limited, but Turkey has got soft power in the on the continent. So if the U.S. and Turkish companies were to partner up, Turkey could do a lot of the local messaging and a lot of the local promotion to make the U.S. look less new imperialist and to kind of erase some of people's suspicions about the Americans. That's an important thing. Of course, much of Turkish investments at the current time will probably occur at the expense of France and at the expense of the United Arab Emirates and at the expense of Egypt. The U.S. obviously views Egypt and the UAE as important to its Middle Eastern strategy, and the U.S. is cooperating with France against Turkey, as talking about really renewing that partnership with France in the Sahel and on counterterrorism, which was broken down last year because of Mark Esper and Trump's uh, uh, criticism of the French counterterrorism missions. So, with that in mind, I think that U.S. Turkey relationships in the economic sphere and cooperation south of Libya might take a little while to take hold, unless there's some de-escalation of the Eastern Med, which France and Turkey agree to some kind of movement away from the current state of brinkmanship, or if Turkey's outreaches towards Egypt and the UAE bear fruit. If those things were to happen, then I think there's a bright future for U.S. Turkey economic cooperation in Africa, because Turkish soft power and American capital can mesh together quite well.
And this soft power emphasis, I personally find like really interesting in this context, especially given that Turkey has made it a point again. I remember being in Istanbul at the airport, all of the connecting flights to Africa. I didn't even see that many when I was in Heathrow, personally, and just even that alone speaks to just the just the reach that Turkey could potentially have on the continent in some ways. On top of, as you mentioned in your piece with MEI,
Right.
was the educational cooperation agreements that they had with these countries. And this, you already mentioned that Turkey doesn't carry the same baggage as a lot of its peers, maybe in Africa, whether it's the U.S., whether it's Russia, France, China, even. But do you find or have you observed that, say, if we were to look at it from the perspective of these African countries, regardless of which area in the region they might be in, do they actively court or seek, say, Turkish involvement in their countries right now, or do you think that's something that's still developing?
So I think that there are certainly some African countries who are courting Turkish involvement in them. I would say beyond just the obvious ones, which are Libya and Somalia, which have kind of shown their loyalty towards Turkey, even in the Arab League, by supporting Turkey's Operation Peace Spring offensive in northern Syria against the Arab consensus. Beyond those two really close partners, there are other countries also that are showing their interest in Turkey. I would say countries like Guinea. I would say Alpha Conde is under isolation, so he's looking towards Turkey as a potential option. Whether Turkey's biting is unclear, but there's bauxite mines there that are at stake. Guinea-Bissau, Niger, Chad, Mali. These countries in the Sahel are looking towards Turkey as a partner. I think Mali in particular could be pivoting towards Turkey more so because of the history that I mentioned earlier of Turkey covering their debt in the 1980s. They have a Cold War era and historical track record that's positive, as well as the fact that the new military regime is anti-French, skeptical of the Americans, and is willing to really pivot towards anybody who's non-Western. So they hold Russian and Chinese flags, and they'll turn to Turkey in the same way. So it's I would say, yeah, Turkey's got certainly an audience that's very engaged in the Sahel. Elsewhere on the continent, Turkey's is a bit lower profile and is a bit more under the radar. So it would require Erdogan and Cavusoglu and others to make more trips there and to a more Turkish investment to be there for Turkey's profile to really rise. I would say that education is an interesting dimension of this because up until 2014, as Federico Dinelli, who just wrote a fine book on Turkey's policy in Africa, has been published in Bloomsbury. It should just be on the markets any day now if it not already is. He talked about how Gulen and Gulenism was an advantage for Turkey. It was a selling point. The educational diplomacy was vital for them. And then they flipped around after the coup, have now having been trying to get countries in Africa to extricate themselves from Gulen and Gulenism. So the very fact that those countries, so many countries in Africa are willing to do that, 29 countries in total, I think, as of earlier this year, suggests that Turkey is seen as a prospective partner by many African countries, even if they may not be actively or publicly courting Turkey. So that's an important distinction to make. It's those private outreaches, it's those subtle signals that show Turkey's power is rising. And that's what we should be thinking about too.
See, in your last answer, you ended up jumping ahead to what I wanted to ask you next, and that
Yeah,
was kind of how, say, we talked about how Turkey's foreign policy rivalries have carried over into their policy in Africa, but
right.
there is that element of their domestic political rivalries also carrying over. And in that case, it's between the AKP Erdogan's party and the Gulen movement, or what might be left of it inside of Africa. And it's interesting to see the amount of effort that Turkey put into their soft power as a means to push some of these Gulenist schools or other outfits out of, in the Sahel, for example. That was covered in your MEI piece also. But how large of a role is it to you in Turkey's soft policy push? To how big of a role, rather, is the AKP Gulen conflict playing in Turkey's conduct of its foreign policy in Africa?
So I would say that it's a complicated question. Obviously, Africa does not have as well developed a Gulenist infrastructure prior to the coup in 2016 as many countries around the world. For example, the United States even had 140 Gulenist academies. But the big reason is that aside from some countries in Central Asia, which is also an important target of Turkey's new foreign policy positioning, and Africa, many countries around the world, the US included, were not willing to go along with Erdogan's push to close these schools. So the very fact that these African countries are closing them has magnified their importance from the domestic Turkish point of view. And they've shown their loyalty towards the AKP and their fealty towards Erdogan personally, as well as Turkey as a country, because he equates kind of the threat of Gulen as being a national security threat together. So it's more significant from that respect, that the show of loyalty and that willingness to kind of show that they're open to doing business with Turkey by closing these Gulenist schools and the Gulenist academies. Though I think it's also one other point to make is that we see a lot of people tend to separate the domestic side of Turkish engagement with regards to cracking down on Gulen and the international side. But there is, in fact, also an ideational rivalry that's at play centered around religion that is important in terms of their competition with rival powers. For example, the notions of secular authoritarianism versus the support for Islamist civil society that we're seeing in Libya, for example, with regards to Turkey and Qatar cheering on the rise of the Muslim Brothers presence there, cheering on the 2011 Arab Spring and its aftermath, whereas the UAE and France are warning and equating any co-option of Islamism or Islamist militias as a kind of extremism and terrorism. And that divide between secularism and political Islam is visible elsewhere in the continent too. So Turkey is much more willing to, for example, engage with Islamic leaders and Islamic civil society on countering extremism and terrorism in Mali and the Sahel, and is averse to the use of military force against Islamist parties. And that's another important part of its soft power that countervenes the French role. Some of that's also happening and is gaining resonance in Nigeria as well, not just in Mali, because Nigeria is suffering a lot from extremist attacks and terrorism, and the UAE has been trying to use Nigeria as a base to, or at least wanted to use Nigeria as a base to strengthen Haftar's presence. So there's an ideational rivalry on the whether to engage with Islam and let Islamic leaders take care of the extremism problem, or whether to use military force. That's an extension of this too. So my point is that religious soft power is certainly important for Erdogan's own survival and cracking down on Gulenism, but that's not the only dimension of religious soft power. It's also tied in very heavily with the ideational polarizations that we're seeing in the Middle East, with Turkey and Qatar on the one end, Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi on the other end, with France and other countries kind of making these situations more acute.
Yeah, we also saw that with Sudan as well,
Right.
where when I mentioned it earlier when Bashir fell. He was close to Turkey to an extent, and then they felt that they lost a partner pretty much on the continent there, and now we have the new government in Sudan, and they have relations with Russia. Well, they always had relationships with the Gulf countries and so on. And Turkey seems to have sort of reconciled, at least in that case, with what is present day Sudan, given that they still have that military base on the in the country. So it's an interesting dynamic to really see play out there in this sort of like ideological struggle going on inside Africa from Turkey's standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Sudan is obviously an important long-term country in Turkey's foreign policy strategy and on the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, because as I mentioned earlier, that pairing between Suakin and Somalia would really give them a kind of Red Sea presence, because Russia's got access to Sudan, but aside from training the Ethiopian Navy, it is relatively peripheral in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, at least from a security standpoint. Djibouti is the concentration where most other bases are, and Turkey seems to be thriving in areas where there's less of a cluster of great powers that are present, which is a strategy that Russia implements too. But Turkey seems to be doing well with that to some extent. And yeah, I would say with regards to Sudan, the Bashir government ultimately in its final months in power was really trying to get lines of credit and economic assistance and solidarity from whoever it could. So Bashir was double dealing with the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and many of these countries wanted leverage in Sudan, so they were very happy with this. But the Emiratis were not. When Bashir turned towards Qatar and Turkey, the Emiratis saw that as an act of betrayal, and that's when the Emiratis started building connections within the Sudanese military, cutting off their financial aid to Bashir, working with Burhan because he had provided their troops in Yemen, and then they engaged in the lead role in the coup that toppled him in April of 2019. So Turkey after that was kind of lost at that moment. It really need to reconfigure its strategy. But with the rise of the civilian government, the Emirates' soft power in Sudan is extremely weak because the Emirati using Sudanese forces in Yemen and Libya. That's a problem for their image in the country. And Turkey will capitalize on that to its advantage. And Turkey will establish closer relations with Abdullah Hamdok and the civilian authorities, whereas Saudi Arabia and the UAE will align more closely with the military authorities, as will Russia. So once the transition to democracy is complete and the civilian authorities have more power and the military supposedly recedes to the barracks just as a support role, then we could see more Turkish opportunities for in Sudan. And the Russians, interestingly, when they were constructing their base in Port Sudan, many Russian defense experts were noting the fact that Turkey is probably going to revive its influence in the future in Sudan. It may revive its support in Suakin. So we need to get this base first so we can preempt Turkey. This idea of preempting Turkey was very present in Russian media commentaries about that base. And I thought that was interesting too.
And absolutely agree on that. It does speak to really just kind of how dynamic this competition for Turkey across Africa is really taking shape. And with that, we are at the end. We are at the end of the program, but that's pretty much a preview to what we'll probably end up discussing sometime soon down the line as new developments really take shape. But until then, Samuel, I really do appreciate you taking the time to give us this tour across Turkish foreign policy in Africa. It's much appreciated, and it's something that's really in need of a lot more attention, in my view.
Definitely, yeah. Really great to be on here, and I hope to see more analyses of this coming up soon.
My name is Nicholas Morgan, and this is Turkey Abroad.